May 3rd, 1945, deep inside the Altaussee salt mine, Austrian Alps. The tunnels smelled of ancient stone and lamp oil as Alois Riegl pressed his back against the cold limestone wall, listening for footsteps above. In his calloused hands he held a pair of wire cutters and a wooden mallet, tools meant for mining, not sabotage. 200 meters deeper into the mountain, past the cathedral-sized chambers where miners had worked for centuries, sat something that didn't belong in a salt mine at all. 8 massive bombs, each containing 500 kilograms of explosives, wired and ready to detonate. The SS had installed them 3 days earlier under direct orders from Berlin. What Riegl couldn't reconcile was the placement. The charges weren't positioned to collapse tunnels or seal entrances. They were aimed at the chambers themselves, designed to obliterate everything inside, as if the goal wasn't military defense, but total annihilation. He moved forward in the darkness, past stacks of wooden crates marked with museum inventory numbers from Vienna, Brussels, Paris. The fuses were crude, almost carelessly installed, as if the SS engineers expected no resistance from Austrian miners who had spent their lives digging salt. That assumption would prove fatal to Hitler's final order. What began as a routine Wehrmacht demolition assignment had become a race between dictatorial vengeance and working-class conscience, with the artistic soul of Western civilization hanging in the balance. The Nero Decree had reached the Alps, and with it, an order to erase history itself. Inside those chambers waited over 6,000 masterpieces stolen from across conquered Europe, including Michelangelo's Madonna of Bruges, Vermeer's The Astronomer, and Da Vinci's original sketches. But the men who worked these tunnels were about to prove that ordinary courage could outsmart totalitarian madness. The order came through the Führerhauptquartier on March 19, 1945. Adolf Hitler signed decree concerning demolitions on Reich territory, a document that would become known simply as the Nero Decree, named for the Roman emperor who burned his own capital. The language was unambiguous. All military transport and communication facilities, industrial establishments, and supply depots within Reich territory were to be destroyed. Nothing of value was to fall into enemy hands. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and War Production, read the directive with mounting horror. He understood immediately that Hitler was no longer fighting to win. He was orchestrating Germany's suicide. The decree reached Linz, Austria within 48 hours. Gauleiter August Eigruber received it in his office overlooking the Danube, where he had governed Upper Austria since 1938 with the fanaticism that had earned him Hitler's personal trust. Eigruber saw the Nero Decree not as madness, but as sacred duty. If Germany could not possess its treasures, then neither would the approaching Americans. The Reich had spent 6
years assembling the greatest art collection in human history through systematic looting operations led by the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, known simply as the ERR. From Paris, they had taken Rothschild collections and Louvre masterpieces. From Belgium, they had seized the Ghent altarpiece, Van Eyck's monumental polyptych that had survived 5 centuries. From the Netherlands, Vermeer and Rembrandt paintings filled rail cars bound for the Reich. From Italy, Renaissance treasures disappeared into German custody. By 1943, Allied bombing campaigns forced Nazi curators to seek secure storage far from urban targets. The Altaussee salt mine, carved into the Salzkammergut Alps 50 kilometers east of Salzburg, offered perfect conditions. The tunnels maintained constant temperature and humidity. The chambers, some large enough to hold cathedrals, provided seemingly infinite storage. The salt itself acted as a natural preservative. Between 1943 and 1945, more than 6,500 artworks arrived at Altaussee. Michelangelo's Madonna of Bruges, stolen from the Church of Our Lady in Bruges. Vermeer's The Astronomer from the Rothschild collection. Leonardo da Vinci's preparatory sketches, Jan van Eyck's panels from the Ghent altarpiece. The treasures represented not merely monetary value, but the accumulated genius of Western civilization, concentrated in chambers that Austrian miners had excavated over centuries of salt extraction. Eigruber summoned SS demolition experts to Altaussee on April 13th. He ordered them to prepare the mine for total destruction. The engineers arrived with 8 massive aircraft bombs, each containing 500 kilograms of explosives. They positioned the charges not at structural weak points, but directly within the art storage chambers. The placement made the intent unmistakable. This was not tactical demolition. This was cultural obliteration. The SS engineers installed crude fuses and detonators, working openly as if no one would dare interfere. But word of the explosives reached the miners who worked those tunnels daily, men whose families had extracted salt from that mountain for generations. And in the village of Altaussee, in the final desperate weeks of the Third Reich, those miners began to understand that they alone stood between Hitler's apocalyptic rage and the survival of humanity's artistic soul. The first sign came on April 28th, when Alois Riegl descended into the western tunnels for the morning shift and heard drilling that didn't belong. Salt miners knew the acoustic signature of their mountain intimately. They could identify the angle of a pickaxe strike by sound alone, distinguish between limestone and halite by the echo of a hammer blow. This drilling was wrong. It came from the Kammerhof chambers, the cathedral-sized vaults where museum crates had been stacked floor to ceiling for 2 years. Riegl had worked these tunnels since 1932. He knew no authorized mining operations were scheduled in those sections. He moved closer, staying in the unlit side passages where decades of familiarity allowed him to navigate by touch. Through the archway into the main chamber, he saw them. SS engineers in field grey uniforms, working under portable electric lamps, drilling mounting brackets into the chamber walls. Beside them sat 8 cylindrical objects, each nearly 2 meters long, stenciled with Luftwaffe markings. Aircraft bombs. Riegl had seen similar ordnance during air raids on nearby Salzburg. These were 500-kilogram high-explosive bombs, the kind dropped on cities. He retreated silently and found Emmerich Pöchmüller, the mine's technical director, in the surface offices. Pöchmüller listened to Riegl's report with a face that revealed nothing, but his hands tightened on the edge of his desk. Pöchmüller had been coordinating quietly with the Austrian resistance network since 1943, passing information to partisan groups operating in the Salzkammergut forests. The resistance consisted mostly of local Catholics, Social Democrats, and former Austrian army officers who had never accepted the Anschluss. They operated through coded messages delivered by priests, mine supervisors, and trusted tradesmen. Pöchmüller sent word through Father Hubert Schönbock, the parish priest in Altaussee village, who maintained contact with resistance cells across the region. Within 3 days, a dozen miners had independently confirmed what Riegl had seen. The SS engineers worked primarily at night, installing the bombs with crude efficiency, but the placement confused everyone who understood demolition engineering. The charges weren't positioned at load-bearing pillars or tunnel junctions where controlled collapse would seal the mine. They were aimed directly at the storage chambers themselves, positioned to maximize destructive force within the enclosed spaces. The fuses and detonators appeared almost carelessly installed, as if the SS engineers assumed no one with technical knowledge would dare interfere. On May 2nd, Riegl and 3 other senior miners entered the chambers during a shift change when the SS guards rotated positions. They examined the bombs closely enough to confirm they were fully armed and functional. The detonation system used simple electric fuses connected to a central firing mechanism. Any competent electrician could disable them, but doing so meant entering chambers under SS guard, removing components without triggering secondary charges, and escaping without detection. Discovery would mean immediate execution. That evening, 8 men gathered in Puckmüller's home on the edge of Altaussee village. They included Alois Riegl, his brother-in-law Josef Riedl, master electrician Hans Gassner, and shift supervisor Emmerich Puckmüller. They spoke in low voices about technical possibilities and moral certainties. They possessed the knowledge to disable the bombs. They knew the tunnels better than any SS engineer from Berlin. They understood that American forces were approaching from the west, perhaps days away, and they recognized with absolute clarity that if they did nothing, 6,000 irreplaceable artworks would cease to exist, buried under 1,000,000 tons of collapsed mountain. The plan began forming that night, sketched on mining diagrams by lamplight, as ordinary men prepared to commit an act that would either save civilization or cost them their lives. The first team descended at 12:40 a.m. on May 3rd. Alois Riegl led, followed by Hans Gassner and Josef Riedl, each man carrying tools they had used for decades in legitimate mining work: wire cutters, wooden mallets, insulated pliers, cold chisels. They moved without lamps, navigating by memory through passages they had walked thousands of times. The SS changed guard posts every 4 hours. The miners had timed the rotation precisely. Between midnight and 4 a.m., a single sentry stood at the main entrance, while the interior guards gathered in the warming room near the surface, drinking ersatz coffee and complaining about assignment to a salt mine in the war's final days. Riegl reached the first bomb at 1:15 a.m. He knelt beside the cylindrical casing and ran his fingers along the detonator assembly. The SS engineers had used standard Luftwaffe electric fuses, the kind designed for quick installation by ground crews under combat conditions. The system was simple. 2 wires connected the detonator to a central firing box located near the chamber entrance. Cut both wires, and the bomb became inert. But if the fuses included anti-tamper circuits, cutting the wrong wire first would complete the detonation sequence. Gassner, who had worked as an electrician before the war, traced both wires by touch in absolute darkness. He identified the ground wire by its slightly thicker gauge, marked its position with his thumbnail, and whispered to Riegl. They cut the ground wire first, then the positive lead. The bomb went silent. They moved to the second device. Same procedure, the third. By 3:20 a.m. they had neutralized 4 of the 8 bombs in the Kammerhof chamber. They worked without speaking, communicating through touch signals developed in decades of underground labor. Each man knew that a single spark from metal striking stone could ignite fumes in the confined space. Each understood that if the SS discovered them, execution would follow within minutes. But they also understood that the wooden crates stacked around them contained Michelangelo's Madonna, Van Eyck's panels, Vermeer's masterworks. They worked in darkness beside treasures they would never see in daylight. At 3:45 a.m., they heard boots on stone. An SS guard had left the warming room early, walking the interior tunnels on an unscheduled patrol. The miners pressed themselves into a side gallery carved for ventilation. The guard passed within 3 meters, his electric torch sweeping across the chamber entrance. He paused. The beam held steady on the detonator box, where fresh scratches marked where Gassner had worked. The guard stepped closer. Then a sound echoed from deeper in the mine, metal on stone, likely another miner team working the eastern chambers. The guard turned toward the sound and moved away. The team completed their work by 4:30 a.m., 8 bombs, all disabled. They had removed the detonators entirely, replacing them with wooden blocks carved to the same dimensions, inserted loosely so a casual inspection would reveal nothing wrong. Then they moved to the auxiliary entrances, the narrow passages known only to men who had worked this mountain for generations. Using techniques perfected over centuries of salt mining, they triggered controlled rockfalls that sealed 2 side tunnels without creating noise that would alert the surface guards. They emerged at 5:10 a.m. just as the guard shift changed, but in the warming room, An SS corporal was reporting to his officer about strange sounds heard during the night patrol and about fresh marks near the detonator station that he couldn't explain. The SS engineers discovered the sabotage at dawn on May 6th when they attempted a routine check of the detonator system. The firing circuit showed no continuity. An inspection team descended into the Kammerhof chamber and found the wooden blocks where functional detonators should have been. Within an hour, Gauleiter August Eigruber received the report at his Linz headquarters. His response was immediate. He ordered SS Sturmbannführer Gerlach to take a detachment of 30 troops to Altaussee, restore the explosives, and execute anyone found responsible for the tampering. Gerlach's convoy arrived at the mine entrance at 11:20 a.m., carrying replacement detonators and demolition charges. But when the SS troops attempted to enter the main tunnel, they found it blocked, not by rockfall or structural collapse, but by men. 43 miners stood shoulder to shoulder across the tunnel mouth, armed with nothing but pickaxes, shovels, and the quiet certainty that they would not move. Alois Riegl stood at the centre. Emmerich Puchmüller stood beside him. Behind them, men who had spent their lives extracting salt from stone now extracted something more valuable, the courage to say no. Gerlach ordered them to disperse. The miners remained motionless. He threatened arrest. They stood firm. He raised his Walter P-38 and aimed it at Riegl's chest, shouting that obstruction of military orders carried an immediate death sentence. Riegl met his eyes and did not step back. The standoff held for 17 minutes, while Gerlach calculated odds that no longer favoured the SS. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. American artillery rumbled from the northwest, perhaps 15 kilometres away. Wehrmacht units were surrendering across Austria. SS authority, absolute for 12 years, was evaporating with each passing hour. The miners understood the mountain's geography in ways no Berlin engineer could match. While Gerlach's men guarded the main entrance, other miners moved through service tunnels and ventilation shafts, staying ahead of every SS attempt to outflank them. They had worked these passages in darkness for decades. They knew which galleries connected, which shafts led to surface exits hidden in the forest, which chambers could be sealed or opened at will. The SS troops, strangers to the mountain, found themselves perpetually one step behind men who navigated by instinct. By 2 p.m., 3 SS soldiers had deserted, disappearing into the woods rather than face what was coming. By 3:30 p.m., Gerlach received word that American forces had captured Bad Ischl, 12 kilometres west. Eigruber's remaining authority extended perhaps 20 kilometres in any direction, shrinking by the hour. The Gauleiter issued new orders: withdraw from Altaussee, regroup in Linz, prepare for final defence. But Gerlach made one final attempt. He ordered his engineers to drill new mounting points for the explosives at the tunnel entrance itself. If they couldn't reach the art, they would collapse the mountain and bury everything. The miners watched the drilling begin and understood they might die here, in the final hours of a war that was already lost, standing between a fanatic's spite and civilization's memory. Riegl placed his hand on the cold stone wall, feeling the mountain that had sustained his family for 4 generations. Behind him, in chambers carved from ancient salt, Michelangelo's Madonna waited in darkness. The Madonna had survived 5 centuries. She would survive this day, or she would perish with the men who refused to move. At 4:15 p.m., the distinctive crack of American M1 Garand rifles echoed through the valley below, and the SS engineers dropped their drilling equipment and ran. The first American jeep reached Altaussee village at 9:15 a.m. on May 8th. The same morning, Germany signed unconditional surrender at Reims. Captain Robert Posey of the Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives section approached the mine entrance expecting the worst. Intelligence reports indicated the SS had wired cultural repositories across Austria for demolition. Posey had already documented destroyed archives in Munich and looted museums in Nuremberg. He anticipated rubble, collapsed tunnels, perhaps scattered fragments of what had once been priceless. Instead, he found men waiting. 40 miners stood at the tunnel entrance, faces blackened with salt dust, eyes hollowed by sleepless nights. Emmerich Puchmüller stepped forward and spoke in careful German to the army interpreter. He explained what the SS had attempted, what the miners had done, and what waited inside the mountain. Posey listened with growing disbelief. The interpreter translated the crucial detail: 8 500-kilogram bombs, all disarmed, 6,000 artworks, all intact. Puchmüller produced a ring of keys and gestured toward the tunnel mouth. Posey assembled a team of engineers to sweep for remaining explosives or booby traps. They entered. Cautiously, portable lamps cutting through darkness that had lasted 6 years. The miners guided them past the disabled bomb sites, showing the wooden blocks where detonators had been, explaining in technical detail how they had neutralized each device. The American engineers examined the work and recognized immediately the precision required. These were not amateurs. These were men who understood demolition engineering from the inside out, who had spent their sabotage in absolute darkness using tools meant for salt extraction. The team reached the Kammerhof chamber at 11:30 a.m. Posey directed his lamp across the space and stopped breathing. Wooden crates stretched 30 meters in every direction, stacked floor to ceiling, each marked with inventory numbers and museum stamps. Vienna, Paris, Brussels, Florence, Krakow. He ordered the first crate opened. 2 soldiers pried the wooden slats carefully. Inside, wrapped in protective cloth treated with preservative compounds, lay a marble sculpture 13 inches high. Michelangelo's Madonna of Bruges, carved in 1504, stolen from the Church of Our Lady in 1944, preserved in salt mine darkness by men who would never see it displayed. They opened more crates. Vermeer's The Astronomer, painted in 1668. Jan van Eyck's panels from the Ghent altarpiece, the single most frequently stolen artwork in history, now recovered again. Leonardo da Vinci's preparatory sketches, Rembrandt portraits, Dürer engravings. Captain Posey, trained as an architect before the war, found himself unable to speak. Sergeant Lincoln Kirstein, a Harvard-educated art scholar serving as a monuments man, sat down on a wooden crate and wept openly. Combat engineers who had stormed beaches and cleared minefields stood motionless before Renaissance beauty they had never expected to encounter. Alois Riegl watched from the chamber entrance, pickaxe still in hand, as American soldiers carefully photographed and documented each discovery. He had worked this mountain for 13 years, digging salt that would preserve meat and flavor food. He had never imagined his hands would save something that couldn't be measured in tonnage or wages, but the work was far from finished. Gauleiter Eigruber had fled toward the Alps with a remnant SS detachment. Thousands of crates remained deep in the tunnels, requiring careful inventory and specialized transport. And across Austria, other repositories waited, some destroyed, some intact, all requiring the same desperate race against time and entropy that had just been won in the darkness of Altaussee. American military police arrested August Eigruber on May 10, 1945, in a farmhouse near Spittel am Pyhrn. He had fled Linz with forged identity papers and a Walter pistol he never fired. At the Nuremberg trials, prosecutors charged him with crimes against humanity, enslavement of forced laborers, and attempted destruction of cultural property under the Nero Decree. His defense attorney argued that following orders from the Führer constituted legal obligation under German military law. The tribunal rejected the argument. On May 28, 1947, Eigruber was hanged at Landsberg prison. His final words were an expression of loyalty to Adolf Hitler. The art repatriation process began while Eigruber still awaited trial. The Monuments Men established a central collecting point in Munich, where artworks from Altaussee and other repositories were transported for documentation, restoration, and identification. The task was staggering. Nazi looting operations had stripped museums, private collections, and Jewish families across 12 countries. Many works carried falsified provenance records. Some had been stripped from their frames and rolled for transport, suffering damage that required months of careful restoration. Salt residue from the mine had penetrated some canvases, requiring chemical treatment by specialists brought from Paris and London. By 1948, the Ghent altarpiece returned to the Cathedral of St. Bavo in Belgium, where crowds gathered to witness its reinstallation. Michelangelo's Madonna of Bruges was restored to the Church of Our Lady, resuming her watch over the altar where she had stood for 4 centuries. Vermeer's The Astronomer returned to the Louvre. Rembrandt portraits reclaimed their places in Amsterdam's Rijksmuseum. The Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna received back thousands of items looted from its own collection. Each return was documented with ceremony, photographed by press agencies, celebrated as victory over barbarism. Alois Riegl returned to mining salt. He worked the same tunnels where he had disabled bombs, extracting halite in 12-hour shifts for wages that barely sustained his family. No medals were awarded. No ceremonies marked his actions. Emmerich Pöschmüller continued as mine technical director until his retirement in 1962. Josef Riedel, Hans Gassner, and the other miners who had risked execution received brief mentions in Austrian regional newspapers, then returned to obscurity. The Monuments Men filed detailed reports crediting the miners with preserving the artworks, but those documents remained in military archives, accessible only to historians willing to search. The disparity was absolute. Generals received ticker-tape parades, soldiers earned bronze stars and purple hearts, museum directors gave speeches about cultural salvation. Meanwhile, the men who had actually saved Western civilization's artistic heritage descended each morning into darkness, carrying the same pickaxes and mallets they had used to cut detonator wires, mining the same salt that had preserved what they had rescued. They didn't speak much about what they had done. In Altaussee village, such things were understood without explanation. The question remained unspoken but unavoidable. The bombs had been armed and positioned. The SS had given orders. The Nero Decree carried Hitler's signature. 8 men with wire cutters and moral clarity had stood between intentional obliteration and survival. What if Alois Riegl had chosen differently that night? What if he had decided that Renaissance paintings mattered less than his own life, that Michelangelo's genius was not worth facing SS execution squads? The mathematics were simple. 8 men, 8 bombs, 6,000 masterpieces. The world would never have known what it lost, because the lost would have been reduced to fragments buried under 1 million tons of collapsed Austrian mountain. But they had chosen otherwise, and the Madonna of Bruges still stands in Belgium, and the choice itself echoes across decades. The Altaussee salt mine operates today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and museum. Visitors descend the same tunnels where SS engineers once drilled mounting brackets for bombs, where Alois Riegl crept through darkness with wire cutters, where 8 men gambled their lives against totalitarian madness. Tour guides explain the technical details of salt extraction and the historical context of Nazi looting. But the deeper question remains difficult to answer in any language. Why did poor men risk execution to save art they would never own, created by masters they had never studied, representing a civilization that had never particularly rewarded their class? The answer lies not in economics or education, but in something more fundamental. Cultural stewardship transcends property rights. The miners understood instinctively what philosophers struggle to articulate, that Michelangelo's Madonna belonged not to Belgium or to the church or to any museum collection, but to human consciousness itself.
The Madonna represented 5 centuries of pilgrims finding meaning in carved marble, 5 centuries of beauty existing simply because one man in 1504 had possessed genius and someone else had commissioned its expression. Destroying it would erase not merely an object, but a testament to what humans could achieve when they worked in service of something beyond survival. The Altaussee rescue was civilization's immune system activating at the cellular level. When the state commanded destruction, individual conscience responded with preservation. When authority demanded obedience, moral clarity insisted on resistance. The miners didn't act from ideology or patriotism. They acted from the recognition that some things matter more than orders, that heritage transcends politics, that what took 5 centuries to create deserved more respect than what could be obliterated in 5 seconds by high explosives and fanaticism. 8 bombs defused by working-class hands saved more beauty than 1,000 military victories. The Third Reich commanded armies that conquered nations, deployed weapons that reshaped warfare, built systems that orchestrated industrial murder. Against that apparatus of totalitarian power stood miners with pickaxes and the quiet certainty that they would not cooperate. Their victory was absolute. Hitler's Nero Decree failed completely. In Altaussee, not because generals disobeyed or politicians intervened, but because ordinary men with calloused hands and intimate knowledge of limestone and salt chose conscience over compliance. Michelangelo's Madonna of Bruges stands today in the Church of Our Lady in Bruges, exactly where she stood in 1504. Vermeer's The Astronomer hangs in the Louvre, light playing across painted fabric exactly as the artist intended in 1668. Jan van Eyck's panels from the Ghent altarpiece have returned to St. Bavo Cathedral after 12 thefts across 6 centuries. Leonardo's sketches rest in climate-controlled archives. The artwork survived not because they were hidden well or guarded carefully, but because 8 men decided that beauty mattered more than fear. Somewhere in the Austrian Alps today, miners still descend into Altaussee's tunnels, extracting salt in the same chambers where their grandfathers once stood between apocalypse and preservation. The mountain remembers. The stone holds memory, the way salt holds flavor. And in museums across Europe, millions of visitors stand before masterpieces without knowing the names of the men who saved them, proving perhaps the most important truth of all, that the greatest acts of human courage often happen in darkness, performed by those who expect no recognition, witnessed by no one except conscience itself and the silent testimony of what survives.